Rogers Fund for the Arts for sponsoring the venue. There will be 15 minutes after this session. Julia will be signing books in the Nowhere bookshop tent, which is outside in the festival marketplace over there. Also, with about 15 minutes left, I'm going to open it up to questions from all of you. And I've been asked to remind you to silence your cell phones and that flash photography is not permitted. So the novel we're going to be discussing is this one, Vigil Harbor, and our guest novelist is Julia Glass. Julia is the author of 6 previous books of fiction, including 3 Junes, which won the National Book Award, and she is a recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, as well as she is now the Senior Distinguished Writer in Residence at Emerson College. So if you could join me in welcoming Julia. So this book was published on May the 3rd, and I'm assuming that not many of you have had the chance to read it, and so I'm going to discuss the book in such a way that I hope will entice you to read it without giving too much away about it. I'll tell you, it's a riveting book. There's a lot of suspense in it that I don't want to spoil, so I'll try to take a more indirect approach to it so that when you read it, you'll have the experience I did when I read it for the first time. So to get started, Julia's going to read the first 2 paragraphs of the novel.
First, I just want to thank you for braving this heat, those of you who are here. And also, at all these events, they've said that the first 2 rows are reserved, but nobody, if you want to sit in the first 2 rows, by all means, move up. Just want to say that. So I also want to say that I came here directly from Boston, where our weather's a little bit different this time of year. And so thank God I looked at the weather in San Antonio before I came and got out my summer clothes. I have never been to San Antonio before. I've been to Austin and to Houston, but I want to say that my grandmother grew up in a little town in Texas called Corsicana, which is fruitcakes come from there, so that's a good joke in the family. And my last trip to Texas was 5 years ago after my dad died. My mother wanted me to bring some of my dad's ashes down and put them in his mother's grave in Corsicana. And I want to tell you, if you ever want to, except maybe late at night, if you want to legitimately put some ashes in somebody's grave, it's quite a bureaucracy to go through. So anyway, but I did that, and that was my last time in Texas. So, changing channels, I will read just the first 2 paragraphs of my novel. That is, if I put my reading glasses on. Let's say it's true that geography is destiny, place entwined with person. Would living on a peninsula, promontory, headland, bluff, make you peninsular by nature? Not someone who sticks out, but someone who likes backing up to a body of water, who finds a cul-de-sac comforting, not cornering. You'd miss out on casual, unpredictable commerce with travelers merely passing through, because your town would be a place of beginnings and endings, of retreat or stasis. And after a while, you'd likely notice a sameness to your neighbors. You'd all be a bunch of proud peninsulites, privileged, but also myopic. That's how some outsiders see the people of Vigil Harbor, a town that thrusts itself into the Atlantic Ocean, all but completely enclosed by restless water, deflecting the longshore current like a crooked foot aimed straight toward the rising sun. On a map, the harbor itself resembles a long blue parcel held snug beneath a muscular arm against the Massachusetts coastline. At the big toe, 2 of the town's oldest roads rise toward a park with a view raised high by granite cliffs. The shoreline here is rugged with rock, nothing like the bygone aprons of silken sand that once turned neighboring towns into summer playgrounds. Much of that sand recently eroded by pummeling rains and swallowed by storms that no longer repay the ground they borrow.
In what you just read, as well as in the title of the novel, place is very important to this novel. Can you say a little bit more about the role of setting in this novel and how you chose this particular setting?
So, the town of Vigil Harbor, which you get to know very well in this book, both in terms of its history as well as its community, is completely based on the town that I moved to in Massachusetts 17 years ago, which is called Marblehead. And some people who know the coast in Massachusetts may know it. It's between Boston and Cape Ann. And it's a peninsula, and it's really hard to find your way there. And then once you're there, it's really hard to find your way out. I used to joke when we moved there that we lived in Brigadoon, because people would find their way there for a dinner party, and then I find out the next day that it took them 45 minutes to get to the town line, which is really a 5-minute drive. So it's a town, and so this is Vigil Harbor that I'm describing, whose origins were as a rough libertarian cod fishing community in the 17th century. And it was a very proudly iconoclastic, separate from the very religious communities of Salem and Cambridge and Boston. And it was crucial to the American Revolution. It was a hotbed of patriot insurgency. It's where George Washington got his navy. The cod fishermen of Marblehead became the Marblehead Mariners. And they saved Washington's butt several times, and they rowed him across the Delaware. So this is a town with enormous patriotic pride. The 4th of July is a week long in Marblehead. But the town went into sort of lapsed into poverty through most of the 19th century and 20th century, and eventually that was discovered as a kind of enclave for, it is today a pretty privileged, very white community of entrepreneurs, academics, and some businessmen, and a lot of yachting people, because we have this beautiful harbor. And so it's a place where people feel somewhat insulated from a lot of the slings and arrows of that beset us. And this novel, although if you know my other novels, and frankly, I think that if you're willing to endure this heat to be here, you probably do, it is a novel about families, neighbors, lovers, husbands and wives. You know, the story is created by the relationships that the people in this town have, but it is also about the forces exerted on these people by the history and the topography of this town. But the one thing I've done differently, and it's funny because I was for some of you here for Emma Straub, she talked about how her new novel, she goes into time travel. Well, so do I in a way, because this novel is set 12 years in the future. And I heard a gasp, which sounded like the reaction from one of my best friends when I told her this, and she looked at me with absolute horror and said, "Oh my God, not dystopia!" And I said, "Dystopia is above my pay grade." So the world of Vigil Harbor is one you'll very much recognize in the lives of the people. But imagine that all the anxieties and fears that keep us up at night about the world at large and our country perhaps, have been, that the volume has been turned up on these things so that politics is more polarized, immigration policies are stricter, and terrorism is on the rise, not terrorism on the scale of 9/11, but domestic terrorism in the name of various causes, including eco-terrorism, because climate change is something, I'm sure living in a hot community like this, climate change is probably a part of your discourse. But living on the Massachusetts coastline, it is very much a part of conversations because our coastline is going to have the sea level rise faster than any other as the years go on from now. So a lot of talk about seawalls and things like that. So I'll stop there and let you ask your next question.
Well, I'm going to return to some of those fears and anxieties that you had just mentioned. Before I do that, I was interested how in the acknowledgments you talk about it took you 10 years to write this book. You started it, you stopped it, you came back to it, you even took up something else. You said you cajoled it, you cursed it, whatever. Could you say a little bit more about the challenges you faced in writing this book and what motivated you to finish it?
So I'll begin that, and that's a very good question, by saying that as a novelist, and I'm really very much a novelist, I rarely write short stories. I describe myself as a serial monogamist, which is to say that I embark on a novel and I am faithful to that novel until publication do us part. And usually it isn't until the novel is in the pipeline with the publisher that I start thinking about the next book. And my books tend to come to me as a single character, which might be surprising considering that my books are often quite have a lot of characters in them. This book is actually narrated by 8 different characters. So the character that I started with here was an architect named Austin Kettner, who builds houses designed in a coastal community designed to withstand severe weather. And secrets are always a part of my, I mean, any of you went to Amanda Ward's event this morning, she also talked about the role of secrets in her fiction. So, and I'm not giving anything away to tell you this, but in Austin's past, he started out in New York City as a young architect, and he had an early relationship, very intense, very passionate, with a seductive, artistic young woman named Isa, who presented herself as a sea creature, come out of the water with a mission. And he was so blinded by love for her that he wanted this relationship to really work, but it ended quite tragically. And leaving him feeling both guilty and ashamed. So you meet him years later, living in Vigil Harbor. He's happily married to a woman with a grown son of her own, and no one knows about this. And then a stranger comes to town who also knew that young woman, who wants to find out what happened to her. And so among other things, and there are many things, that secret, you can see from the start, that secret is going to be revealed. So you, the reader, know this. You'll find out more about that relationship. But, I think what happened to me, in part, was that I thought, what am I doing? Am I going to write about like a mermaid or a selkie? I mean, that's not me any more than writing 12 years in the future is me. So, I felt like, have I been hit on the head by some heavy object? What's going on here? And I found myself procrastinating enormously in really unusual ways. But at the same time, I was cheating on my book because these 3 other characters who had nothing to do with Vigil Harbor emerged, and they were a woman who was an assistant to a famous children's book author, a British movie star, and a museum curator. And this literally felt like an affair, because I would think, okay, I'm allowed to think about those characters when I'm in the shower, when I'm walking the dog, and then I did the thing I swore I wouldn't do, which was that I created this little file folder in the lower left hand of my desktop, far away from the folder with the book I was supposed to be working on. And I'd say, okay, I can just kind of go over there for 10 minutes. Well, guess what? I left this novel and I wrote that other novel, and that's A House Among the Trees, my last novel. So after I finished that, I went back sort of hat in hand to this book and thought, oh my God, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna write it? And I'm very stubborn. I thought, I'm gonna make this work. And now, here's what happened. Between the time that I stopped writing that book in, I'm gonna say 2015, and published A House Among the Trees in 2017, some things were very different about the world, including our president. And on June 1st of 2017, and I had to look this up because I was thinking, how did this really happen? That I got back to this book. I was pulling into the parking lot of our local gardening center with the intent of buying a tree for my little yard. And I was listening to NPR, and the president is about to come on. And everybody knew what he was going to say, but I was stopped in the parking lot and thought, no, he's not going to say that thing. But he did. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. And I sat in my car and I cried. I cried for about 10 minutes. I thought, do these people have children? You know, what are they really this blind? Do they understand how urgent all of this is? And went and bought my tree. That year, 2017, turned out to be a year of very extreme weather. It was a year of 17 named storms, 10 of which were hurricanes, 3 of which were Harvey, Irma, and Maria, which, as you all know, especially down here, you know the damage. I think both Harvey and Irma hit Texas pretty hard, didn't they? And, you know, I don't think Puerto Rico's anywhere close to recovering from Maria at this point. And then I knew, as I was sitting down with this novel, this is going to be the backbone of this novel. What might it be like in a decade? And so I had, I didn't set about to write a climate change novel, and I wouldn't call it that. You know, as I like to say, I don't write political novels, but my characters are contemporary people who inevitably intersect with politics, with the law, with all the concerns we have, and so that's what makes up this. That's what got me going again. And this is the other thing I thought to myself. I thought, supposing that you are a climate scientist or a climate activist, an activist for, really making change. How does it feel to be completely ignored? Would there come a point when you would resort to violence, when you would decide that in order to be heard, you would resort to terrorism? And that too is a part of what happens in this book.
You've mentioned climate change, political terrorism, and these other developments. One other thing that I thought was really interesting in your novel were references to the pandemic, which I take to be a very late addition in your writing of the novel. Can you say a little bit more about the role why you included references to the pandemic and the role that the pandemic, or is it an ongoing or past event, plays in the novel?
Yeah, so I had pretty much finished a draft of this book. Actually, in February of 2020, I was invited to go with 13 other women writers, fiction, nonfiction, children's books, playwright, to a beautiful old inn on the shore of Lake Cayuga in upstate New York. And we just had the run of the place, and for 2 weeks, we were in our fuzzy slippers and carrying our laptops around and reading to each other. And I wrote so many pages. I was just almost done. I went home very pleased, thought, I'm almost there, March 2020. And like a lot of writers, I couldn't write a word for a few months. And then in June, and I'm a teacher, so I thought, I've got to work this summer, I've just got to do it. And but I thought, what am I going to do? Because here's the sort of paradox about writing in the future. The nearer the future you write about, the narrower your margin of error. So if I've been writing 50 years in the future, I can probably say, hey, that old pandemic, way in the past. But in the year 2034, which if you do the math, is the year in which this book takes place, it would be, no matter what happens, it would be very near in the rearview mirror. So I thought, what am I going to do? Do I once again abandon this book? But you know what I realized? All of my characters are struggling in one way or another or they have a history of a heartbreak, loss, disappointments overcome, dreams that didn't quite turn out the way. I mean, that's true for all my characters in all my fiction, because I believe in writing about how do we go on after enduring things that are really hard to endure. So in a way, the pandemic fit in well. So all I had to do was go into it and just think about each character. Where was that character in 2020, 2021? Where and how did the pandemic affect and influence their lives? And then when I turned it in, my editor, who read an earlier draft, said to me, you know what? She said, the pandemic gave your book a really solid infrastructure. And so it's there. It's not, you'll see, people wear masks occasionally or whatever, but it's not the largest, concern in there. But it is, but I did have to go and jury rig it in there.
I really thought when I read it, it was one of the best post-pandemic novels I've read. I'm glad you brought it up to date by including it. One other thing, you mentioned the political backdrop of the novel, which includes, and I have a list here of scenes of shootings, bombings, domestic terrorism. Characters talk about the presence of political rage tearing apart society. And one says that in America, we're not a we anymore. And I was interested in how all of this finds its way into the news in your novel. And there are lots of references to the news that characters are, one says, it calls the news all terror all the time, and they seek to get safe from the news and resist the impulse to check on it. That seems fairly current, at least in my life. And so what's your attitude toward the news here?
Well, like everybody, I was a champion doom scroller back in the day. And by the way, I want to assure you that this is a novel that you'll laugh a lot too. I promise. Guaranteed or your money back. I mean, there's humor and there's satire in this book. And like all my books, there's hope. There is hope. In fact, I just have to say, I'm so glad I went to a talk a couple hours ago in an air-conditioned venue about the coral reefs, because I did not know that there is, in fact, a lot of hope for restoring some of the large coral reefs. And the death of coral reefs is mentioned parenthetically in my book. I was like, wow, that's so cool. So I felt very happy about that. But, we're in an age of, and it's not going to change, of over communication, over sharing, over addiction to news. I mean, I am very low tech in a way, but my husband forced me to buy an iPhone a month ago. I had this Samsung that I called my dumb phone, and I just ignored it, and I'd ignore it for days. He said, "You are not going out on tour without a smartphone." And now I've discovered it does all these things, and it talks to me, and it offers me things, and it's like having a devil in my purse. So, and I see the allure. So in my world, 12 years, everybody has something called a wall screen, and it's just an embedded screen, in your kitchen wall or wherever. And so people refer to having the wall screen on, or it's on and it's muted. And, there's always news feeds, and everybody's phone lets them know if some major catastrophic thing has happened. At one point, a character who's got his phone turned off hears people walking past his house, and the news pings go off. And so, of course, he goes to his phone because and his son lives in New York City, and he's an aspiring actor, and he's terrified for but people go on living. I mean, New York City is a place where some small terrorist bombings have happened, and in fact, the architect's stepson, a 21-year-old named Brecht, has come home, left college in New York City because he narrowly survived a bombing in Union Square, and he is trying to collect himself and figure out where to go from there. And yet most of the people you meet are feeling, they live in this very trusting community where people don't lock their doors and feel falsely as if they're safe from a lot of what's going on.
Well, I want to get to some of these sources of hope, but I was interested when you and I were emailing about the session. You offered to read another selection for your novel to show that it wasn't all doom and gloom, and that came to a great moment in my working on this, because I was going off the deep end of doom and gloom, and so maybe to show the other side of the novel, you could read that section, and then we can talk about some of the sources of hope that offset all these serious crises.
I'm not sure that this is so much a source of hope. I hope a source of humor. So one of the inciting incidents of the book is, as I told you, there's a yacht club here, and there are two couples in the yacht club, the Tattersalls and the Iliescu's. And close to the start of the novel, after a gala banquet at the yacht club, Tom Tattersall and Deanne Iliescu inform their respective spouses that they are running away together to a survivalist colony in Wisconsin. And so both of these respective spouses are left shell-shocked. They had no idea. In one case, heartbroken, maybe not so much in the other case. So Mike Iliescu is a very gentle man. He's a marine biologist. He's a very loving father, by the way, both of these couples are in their 50s with children just out of the nest. And but Margot Tattersall is a retired English teacher. She taught in the high school, and she, as I describe her, is the teacher that every parent, every child dreads having. And one thing you should know about her is that she feels that if you are in a job where your mouth and your language are policed 5 days a week from 8 to 3, you get to swear like a sailor the rest of the time. So prepare yourself. So this is Mike. Mike has been moping around his house by himself for about a week since his wife decamped. I drank too much, bourbon my poison of choice, and ate very little. One night I emptied the jar of almonds, almost literally pouring them down my gullet, as I thought with grim, illogical glee of how much that jar had cost, trying to recall precisely when almonds had become a gastronomic luxury comparable to caviar. Caviar now all but unobtainable, no matter how much money you cared to spend. So many curiously random foods, a thing of the past. Passion fruit, vanilla beans, certain kinds of tea, never mind codfish. I tried not to imagine Deanne and that absurdishly giraffish man fucking in the tiger maple four-poster bed she had bought on our honeymoon in Nantucket. Failing to shut out those images, I took to sleeping down the hall in the twin bed once occupied by my son Egon. Every night when I turned out the lamp, I found myself drunkenly astonished that those plastic stars and planets I had affixed to the ceiling still, decades later, glowed so resolutely in the dark. I awoke every morning to behold, through my jackhammer headache, a time-warped poster of some ambisexual movie star playing Macbeth, reminder of yet further anxiety, a child well past childhood who wants to be an actor, or is an actor when he can be, worse, a child living in New York City. I knew it was unsustainable, my gloomy retreat, and I knew I would have to move, sell the house. I would have to ask Egon and Miranda to come home one final time and sort through their childhood relics. I would also have to start answering my phone, or at least looking to see exactly whom I was ignoring. Egon and Miranda were the callers I dreaded most, and I wondered if, had they lived closer, one or both of them would have materialized at the door on a mission of mercy. As if my wondering had summoned it, on day 8 of my self-exile, the second Sunday, the front door knocker sounded vigorously, leading me to assume it was a man, though it was too vigorous to signal the arrival of my gentle son. Deluded has become my middle name. Please tell me you are taking that whore for everything she's fucking worth. Standing on my granite stoop was Margot Tattersall, whom I had last seen at the yacht club dinner, the final hours of my evidently willful ignorance. Possibly hers as well, our last conjugal supper. When I failed to answer her challenge, she asked if she could come in. Could I say no? Why didn't I want to say no? Casting an eye over the teetering stacks of cereal bowls and highball glasses in the sink, she said, "Another woman would sigh with compassion and put this place back in order." She stared at me fiercely. But then she did sigh with compassion, and her tone softened. "I know it's noon, but I know we need a drink. And I see from the contents of the sink that you have not been shirking in that department. Let me guess. A diet of cornflakes washed down by Manhattans." She lifted a glass from the sink and sniffed it. "Am I a genius or what?" she said. And from a canvas shoulder bag, she pulled out a bottle of, yes, bourbon. She ordered me to find or clean 2 glasses. As I obeyed, Margot said, "So what did you do to drive the spouse away?" "Are you blaming this on me?" I said, the first words out of my mouth since her arrival. "Of course not. But the general assumption around town was that you and that whore led a peaceful coexistence, probably spiced up with torrid sex. fascinated science guy being the male version of the smoking hot librarian. I mean, you were just about the only couple who never fell into a boozy squabble at one of the club dinners. Oh, they're so simpatico, and he's so smart, she drawled. I don't know who would say that, I said. Most people there found me a crashing bore. Hearing myself assess my reputation at the club in the past tense, I realized that I would resign. This felt like a glimmer of good news. Who knew, I asked, about them? Not me, said Margot. I'd have had your wife's head on a platter, Salome style. If others knew, I will find out, and I'll decapitate them promptly. Impale their heads on the tallest masts in the harbor. This did not sound like a woman with a broken heart. A wounded ego, sure. Yet Margot was one of the club wives I had always vaguely enjoyed. She never hid her opinions. She was an accomplished solo sailor, and it was hard not to notice what a sexy dancer she was at the banquets. A little overweight by social standards, she wore dresses that told the world she liked her shapely shape. Do your children know? I asked. I told Tom I'd slit his throat if he didn't let me break the news. She asked about Egon and Miranda. When I admitted I hadn't spoken with them yet, she took a slug of her bourbon and actually whistled. Because I've been answering calls selectively. Oh, Mike. Jesus, Mike, you're a good man, but you're kind of a coward, aren't you? Perhaps my not feeling offended by Margot's remark only proved her right. In answer to your first question, I said, she's left me with practically everything. Ouch. Now that's emasculating, isn't it? Almost stunning, the sound of my own laughter. So let's get you out of this house. She picked up a peppermill shaped like a Balinese dancer. Away from all her tacky bourgeois shit. That is step one of your rehabilitation. Who asked you to rehabilitate me? I said. I need a new hobby. I've chosen you. So
I'm going to turn it over now to see if you have any questions you'd like to ask about anything you've heard or other work by Julia.
It just seems, was there a reason to choose 12?
Why did I choose 12 years in the future? I didn't, it sort of, the time sort of chose me because when I was writing it, it was like maybe 15, 16. It's just like I sort of chose a point because, and you know what, COVID made me have to commit because I had to say when, that's actually what did it. So then it was just a matter of when do I finish it, then the time is, it's 12 years from now, but had it been published 2 years ago, it would have been 14 years from now. See, so it kind of arrived at that point. Nothing magical about the number 12. Other people? Yes?
I know you looked at the long process of completing this book. Your other poems, how long do they normally take to create a novel?
So the question is, how long does it usually take me to write a novel? So my first novel, 3 Junes, was evolved from a short story that became a novella. And also I had no contracted money, so I had less time to write fiction. So that one, I can't even say how long it took. Maybe 10 years, maybe really, once I knew it was a novel, 2 or 3. But the others have taken anywhere from 2 to at most 4 years, sometimes less than 2, really. So there's kind of an interval. But I've been very fortunate to be always writing on a contract, which gives you, lights a fire under you. My publisher is not the kind of publisher that finds you every day you don't make your deadline. I just knew, it's time to be hustling here. And I'm very lucky to have had, an advance that helps pay the bills in addition to my teaching. Teaching slowed me down a little bit, though, I will say that. Yeah. Anyone else?
When you're creating your characters, do you spend time fleshing them out ahead of the writing, or do they develop as you're writing?
That's a good question. So the question is, when I develop a character, do I sort of spend time developing them and then write about them, or do they develop as I'm writing about them? And I would say pretty definitely the latter. The only time that I have to do a lot of character development before I commit to the page is if I've created a character because I have to create that character. Like, let's say that I create, here's an example from my second book. The main character is a pastry chef in New York City in that book. And I knew that she had to work for a restaurant probably. So I had to create the restaurateur that she works for, kind of a restaurant. So I had to do a lot of, and that's what I call the muscular work of fiction. It's like going to the gym to create those characters. They don't just, sneak up on me the way I would like them all to do. But you know what sometimes happens, and that happened in that instance. I fell in love with the character I worked so hard to create, and he became much more important than I thought he would be. And one of the pleasures of writing forward into the dark, which is how I describe the way I write, is that I'll be surprised by the end which characters are the dominant characters. I thought this architect would be what I call my alpha protagonist. No. He's still in there, he's got a voice, you hear his wife's voice, and there's a character for anybody who's read my novel, The Widower's Tale. The Guatemalan landscaper Celestino is back, very important character. But the two characters Margot is a blast, and I hope that if you buy the book, you'll really enjoy the chapters from her point of view, because she has this very, no nonsense, kind of firecracker outlook on the world. And sometimes when I was inside her, I felt like, God, I wish I were this wise. Characters say things and you think, wow, that's true. I didn't know that. But the two characters that kind of surprised me were Brecht, this young man who's shell-shocked. Writing from 20-somethings is very scary for me because you get it wrong, you really get it wrong. It's like, old lady, you don't know from, this. But he has a very important voice in the book. And he has the first chapter after the prologue I read, and he has the last say. And his arc really surprised me. And I'm getting kind of chills. It was a gift. He was a gift to me in a way. And the other character is Mike, this marine biologist who was depressed anyway, even before his wife leaves him. But as I said to a friend of mine, I'm writing a book that includes a depressed marine biologist, and she said, "What marine biologist would not be depressed?" So his work is frustrating, and he's having some but very minor successes, and I felt so protective of him. He's the character I just said I have to find a way for Mike's story to end in a good place without writing him some happy ending. And I did, I think. And I felt like, I was able to give Mike an ending that is uplifting to a certain degree and hopeful. And I really hope that the book ends on a hopeful note.
Yeah, one of the things I'm absolutely fascinated by is the fact that so many of the characters and their circumstances are so familiar that many of us have those kinds of people in our lives and those kinds of things happening. But the one thing that has been universally true for me in this novel is surviving the 2 years of being in my home for the pandemic. And there's a lot of discussion that's going on among me and my friends about what things that we learned during that period about ourselves and what things we want to keep and what things we never want to see again, some of the food we ate. But I'm just curious, as you were writing about the future, how did you look back on this period?
So the question is, the 2 years of the worst part, we hope the worst part of COVID that we have lived through, what do we want to keep? What do we want to never see again? And what have we learned about ourselves? So this is the one thing that I had a real problem with, because mind you, I finished this book in 2020. So I had to project what will it be like? And I had no idea. You know, I finished this book before being vaccinated. I mean, it got turned in. I mean, I did more work on it, but not substantive. So the, you know, if I had finished this book in the summer of 2021, I think I would have had more to give my characters there. You know, Brett, the young man, so in the original story, his father had been severely asthmatic and died of an asthma attack when he was a little boy. And I instead made his father died in the first wave of COVID in New York City. And so he was living with his grief-stricken mother, grief-stricken little boy, 8 years old, in an apartment in New York. And you hear him talk about some of that and how, you know, I think you feel that in some ways it traumatized him a bit, but he has a closeness to his mother that you feel that even as a 21-year-old, he's very sensitive to his mother, who's in a very fragile state at this point. And you get a little of her point of view. But I felt like this young man knows his mother this well because he was cooped up alone with her in New York City for so long. And that was one thing I was definitely able to project.
So we have 1 minute left. I'm going to ask one really quick question that won't be asked nowhere but at this book festival, which is you describe one character as having a, quote, plush San Antonio accent.
Oh my God. You know something? Somebody teased me last week and said, you know, you're going to San Antonio and you use San Antonio. I said, no, I don't. She said, yes, you do. You San Antonio is in your book. That's so funny.
I take it it's a compliment, right?
So, it is, well, first of all, the person who has the plush San Antonio accent there's a character in the woman who comes and outs the secret about the Issa, was married to a woman for 21 years named Carly who came from San Antonio and who she's missing very much, and she's remembering her late wife's accent. But did I know what that accent sounded like? No, I just was like, San Antonio, without knowing that I was going to get invited here. And thank you, because now I know where it is.
You can be creative. Well, thank you all very, very
So
much.
I'll be signing books over in that even higher tent if anybody wants to in a little while. And I just want to say also, you know, please support your local independent bookstores, whatever they may be. And also, those of you who are into audiobooks, this audiobook has 9 performers, one of which is my 26-year-old son, which is so exciting for me. I haven't heard it yet. I don't know whether I have to send him to his room or not, but thank you very much.
I know, I'm just taking ass.